hi everyone. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully this works. All right, how does that look? Do you see presenter view? Sorry, do you see?
Yep, perfect. Yeah, I can see it.
Wonderful, awesome. Right, hi everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Nicola, and thank you for the invitation to speak at LJMU at this seminar series. In the vein of decolonizing science curriculum, I'm going to talk today about what it means to decolonize your field or your curriculum with a specific zoology or field biology perspective, or even herpetology. And this presentation came to fruition from a series of fascinating discussions I had with the wonderful people listed here, Dr. Sheila Poo from Memphis Zoo and from my university, Oregon State, Stephen Johnson, Christy Cruz, Carmen Harjo, Natasha Young, and Dr. Laurie Kays. So before I launch into the content of this, I'd like to set up a roadmap for this presentation, what this presentation isn't and what it is. So I believe that most of us here in this audience, me included, come from mostly a scientific background, and we are not social scientists. And I like to think of scientists as semi-literate onlookers into the social sciences, and we're not equipped to produce or teach social science. The field of intellectual decolonization spans decades and has its roots in the global south, so it's not a new topic. And we know that science is a social endeavor conducted by humans, and it's not purely objective. The way we conduct science in our professions is not immune to all these forms of oppression and bias, and decolonization of science is necessary to produce good science. These are facts. I'm not in any position or I don't have a background to debate them, so it's not the point of this talk either. And I like to compare scientists debating decolonization a little bit like a group of social scientists sitting on an island going, are climate change and sea level rise even relevant to society? Discuss. And finally, I'd like to point out that despite my completely ridiculous accent, I have a really US-centric view of this world, as I spent most of my adult life here. So several things might not be transferable culturally, but I'll let you decide what they may be. So today's talk is divided into 3 parts. First, we're going to delve a little bit into what we actually mean when we say we want to decolonize our fields, our curriculums, or our professions. In the second part, I'm going to hone in on some individual experiences in the world of herpetology that illustrate inequities and what we can do about it in our classrooms. And finally, concrete steps we can take in the quest to decolonize our curriculum and science. So I am a field biologist and ecologist by training, and I'm of the opinion that there are specific challenges to zoology and field biology in ways that might not manifest in less geographical and field-based areas of science. So consider the global distribution of biodiversity on this planet and think about how this might differ from the global distribution of biologists on the planet. The same pattern is mirrored in the location and the use of the world's natural resources. Where are these resources located and who gets to access and use these resources? In ecology or biology, the history of some major tenets of our field, including evolution by natural selection, came about from colonial voyages to explore undiscovered lands, as opposed to more abstract fields where you can discover things tinkering in your backyard shed. This colonial structure is reproduced in the form of modern-day helicopter research, where researchers from wealthier countries fly to a developing country, collect data, analyze the data and samples, publish the results with little or no involvement from local researchers, and local colleagues might only be used to provide logistics. The resulting scientific publications may only contribute to the career of the scientists from the wealthy country and institution, but not much to local science. There's also an aspect of zoology that has this clear human-animal component where anyone, regardless of education or background, has ideas and perceptions about animals. And we can then examine the disparity in who are the people on this globe who form the majority of human-animal contacts versus who is depicted in academia and media as being the experts on animal interactions. So besides being a superficially accessible field to the general public, disparities in field zoology or field biology have real life consequences in terms of human mortality and morbidity. You can ask yourself, where is the distribution of zoonotic or animal-caused diseases on this planet? And what is the distribution of scientists who study zoonotic diseases? Consider neglected tropical diseases. The vast majority, if not all of them, are zoonotic or animal in origin. And it makes no sense that 20 diseases that affect 1 billion human beings are considered neglected. In reality, we cannot disentangle global healthcare inequities with a country's history of colonial subjugation. We can also see how inequalities play out in non-neglected tropical diseases like malaria. Who gets easy access to anti-malarial medication, for example? I could walk into a healthcare facility in the US or my home country in Singapore and get anti-malarial medication to go on a backpacking trip through Southeast Asia, while communities living in hyper-endemic malarial zones may not have the same access that I do. The link between colonialism, biogeography, disease, and global healthcare inequities cannot be ignored if we examine zoology, the study of animals. So here's where I need Nicola to help me out. And I'm going to start off with a series of definitions to see if we're all on the same page. So let's test out this Zoom poll that I set up with Nicola. And I'd like to invite everyone to participate if you can. Let's see if it launches. Aha, great. Super easy. The question is, what can you realistically achieve as an educator? And you can check all that apply. It's not just one answer. So first, can you grant political independence to an entity that is currently a colony or return lands to indigenous people? Click number 1 if you can do that. Second, can you free minds from colonial ideology and the dominance of discourses originating within influential groups and dismantle the global apartheid in higher education? Third, can you have representation in your curriculum in all the ways in which people differ, encompassing the different characteristics that make one individual or group different from another? Fourth, can you create fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all people while eliminating barriers that have prevented the full participation of certain groups? Fifth, can you create a classroom in which any individual or group feels welcome, respected, supported, and valued to fully participate? And finally, can you create an accurate representation of the sum of human knowledge in your field? So just click as many as apply. And I think, Nicola, when you see enough people, you can just launch, you can just show results.
Okay, it's ticking up at the moment. So about half people have answered,
Awesome.
But it's still, I'll just wait another 10 seconds maybe while until it stabilizes a little bit. Just some last minute responses coming in. Okay, I think I'm going to end the polling there. So we've got the majority and share results. Can you see the results, Anne?
Yes, great. Excellent. So I'm really glad to see that only 3% of you said you would grant political independence and return land. If it was all of you, I would probably be in the wrong Zoom call. But it seems like number 5, create a classroom in which everyone feels welcome, respected, seems universal almost. I think the 3% is me. I didn't. I clicked number 1. All right. So I'm going to close the poll. This is great. Is it possible to remove it, Nicola? Oh, you can remove it ourselves. Yeah. Awesome, great. So I'm going to reveal what the definitions of all of these are. So the first 2 actually describe decolonization. One is decolonization from a political standpoint. The second one is an intellectual decolonization, which is what we're after when we're talking about decolonizing curriculum. And the next 3 define diversity, equity, and inclusion, which are great and lofty goals. And the last one, accurate representation of the sum of human knowledge in my field, is simply good science. So intellectual decolonization, number 2, has a very, very specific definition and goal, and all the rest of them, 3 through 6, are great and lofty and necessary, but we should not conflate them with the term decolonization. Any of us wishing to decolonize our curriculum need to be clear on what we're trying to do while recognizing political and academic trends that come and go with higher education. And number 5 seemed to be most popular, is to create a classroom in which everyone feels welcome, respected, supported, and valued. So it seems that inclusion is important to everybody, which is fantastic, because that is one step above diversity, where you actually have people are welcome to the table and have equal footing within a classroom, for example. All right. So the word decolonization is in vogue. It is fashionable in higher education. There have been recent social and political movements, such as Black Lives Matter in the USA, and I think that's gone global. Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa, Why is My Curriculum White in the UK? And they have gained widespread attention in the past decade. So terms like decolonizing curriculum, anti-racism, STEM equity, inclusion are becoming shared and common language for academics across multiple science fields, even though we don't really have a background in social science. So on the other hand, the field of intellectual decolonization has been going on for decades with its roots in the Global South. And the word Global South itself is problematic, but that's a conversation for another day. So what we need to do as scientists and academics is to disentangle the need for decolonization of our science from social and political movements that come in waves. Instead, we should think about it as, I want to produce and teach good science. Decolonizing my field and my curriculum will help me achieve this goal. And with that, I'm going to move to the second part of this talk. And so far we've been talking about fairly abstract concepts, a lot of hand waving on my end. So I want this section of the talk to bring things to a little bit more of a personal level by looking at how inequities manifest in the lived experiences of biologists. I'm going to describe 2 anecdotes, the underlying assumptions which led to these unfortunate anecdotes, and an antidote that can be applied in the myriad of ways that we teach and conduct science. So we always keep in mind that most people you meet in your life are just really nice and polite. The intent of the statements are almost always good, but the impact can be wildly different. So the first anecdote comes from my friend and colleague, Dr. Sheila Pu, who I think is in the audience today. Dr. Pu is Taiwanese American, and she speaks 4 languages fluently. And prior to this event, she had already published multiple first author papers with collaborators who had English sounding names, whatever you want to define that as. She has a PhD in all aspects you can think of, an established amphibian biologist and a good writer. Post-PhD, she authored a manuscript where all the authors had non-English sounding names. And then when the review came back, one of the comments was, please get a native English speaker to edit this manuscript. I'm cringing, I'm not sure if you are. So let's examine the underlying assumptions that led to this unfortunate incident. First assumption the reviewer made is that a native English speaker would be better at writing than a non-native English speaker. We're a group of educators in this room who we grade assignments. We all know that native English speakers can be absolute garbage writers. The second assumption made here was that the writing was inadequate, and this is probably to do with unconscious bias and looking at the author names and then reading the manuscript. And the third assumption is that none of the authors are native English speakers. How on earth would they know? Also, they were wrong. And finally, even if the writing was not adequate, the reviewer made the assumption that the writing is inadequate because the authors are not native English speakers. It's a lot of assumptions there. And maybe the authors are all native English speakers and not just rubbish writers. This problem is ubiquitous in peer review, and the antidote is fairly straightforward. If you are a reviewer, editor, grader, or any of the above, name the problem and not what you think the problem is. So instead of talking about native English speakers or who speaks what language, just say writing unclear, edit for language and clarity. Second, as scientists and reviewers and editors, we should collectively critique the peer review process and realize that it's not immune to all forms of conscious and unconscious bias, and we should teach these in our classrooms. These biases translate to what resources are available to me to draw my curriculum from. Who are the gatekeepers of publishable data that I can include in my syllabus? And here I'd like to recommend two excellent articles. One's about how international journals can promote ecology from the global south, published by Journal of Applied Ecology. And another is on the persistent lack of international representation on editorial boards in environmental sciences. The vast majority of editors in science come from the UK and the US, which is of course not representative of the knowledge that is being produced around the world in these fields. Our next anecdote is something that I personally experience on a regular basis. I hope it will get better as I get older, but we shall see. I did a bunch of work on snakes for my master's degree, where I tracked arboreal vipers and did some movement analyses. And even if you didn't pay attention to this presentation that I gave about snakes, you would take away two things: is that I played with a bunch of arboreal vipers, and then I did a bunch of stats on them. So it's not that these stats are particularly complicated, but I certainly couldn't do them by hand. And a question I received was, do you know how to use the program R? You could do some cool analyses with R. And the second question was, did you catch the snakes yourself? Let's look at the underlying assumptions of these unfortunate questions. First, they assume that I don't know how to use R. Second, they assume that R would be a better language than whatever I had chosen to use. Third, they thought that I should be informed that R is an option for me. And I quote cool analyses. The second person made the assumption that catching snakes might be difficult. I think anyone who works with mammals will tell you that mammals are far more tricky to work with than snakes. And the fifth assumption is that I needed help catching these snakes. The two antidotes to these are fairly straightforward. And whenever I talk to scientists about their science, regardless of who I'm talking to, I try to ask myself, would I ask this question of a middle-aged white man? And if the answer is no, maybe I should reconsider the question. And the second antidote is where we come in as educators, and we can try to change the culture and representation of traditionally white male-dominated fields. So when I think snake biologist, I now think of my friend and colleague Mary Ruth Lau, who is the go-to expert on reticulated pythons, among other things. And the imagery you show your students can be incredibly powerful. And in the talk, later in the talk, I'll get to some specific examples of how you can do this. So this brings us to the third and final part of the talk. So it's very easy to be all doom and gloom and talk about how inequalities are affecting the world, but what can we actually do about it as people who yield disproportionate amounts of power compared to most human beings on the planet? So the questions I ask myself when I'm thinking about decolonizing science are, where do I even begin? How do I approach sensitive topics if I'm new to it? What resources are available to me? And horror, what if I make a mistake? So let's start with a Christopher Columbus analogy to developing curriculum. I used Christopher Columbus because in the hopes that no one would be offended, he seems to be a universal punching bag. But the first here in how we teach history, at least in the US, is that Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas, and we celebrate Columbus Day. We still celebrate Columbus Day in some states in the US. If we want to head closer to the truth, we should understand and teach people within their, we should teach that people with their own cultures and rich knowledge already existed in the Americas, and we should incorporate their contributions to human knowledge and society in our history curriculum. The true decolonization process would be to study and acknowledge the harm, the active harm that Columbus inflicted on an indigenous people, understand the historical context in which this happened in order to be able to teach our students how our revisionist history curriculum came into being and how this has impacted our perceptions of society and history. So there are two key points I'd like to mention on our journey to decolonizing science. And the most important point is that decolonizing your science leads to better science. Without decolonization, we don't have the full picture. So imagine you're a scientist developing and testing a hypothesis, only having read a tiny fraction of available human knowledge on the topic. That is not rigorous science. We shouldn't look at decolonizing our curriculum as this side job that takes extra time and saps our energy. It is the job we need to do if we want to improve our fields. Second, it's important to note that people in STEM fields are so behind the curve when it comes to decolonizing our professions, and we are not at some exciting frontier. Many other fields in academia are way ahead of us, and there is this plethora of literature to draw from, especially in the social sciences. So if you're a scientist winning awards for decolonizing science in the 21st century, congratulations on your 1960s award. So let's examine some specific examples that may give us insight into decolonizing and diversifying our curriculum. Faculty and students in my department, integrative biology at Oregon State University, have some excellent initiatives that I'd like to highlight as examples. One of our faculty, Dr. Laurie Kays, is a recipient of an Inclusive Excellence Grant from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and they have a paid position for a teaching assistant, a graduate student, Natasha Young, whose job is to implement ways of decolonizing the curriculum into their intro biology classes. And these are classes that all biology-related majors have to take. And they do this in 3 ways, which align nicely with the tier 2 and 3 of the Christopher Columbus analogy I mentioned before. So the first is representation. They have a Spotlight the Scientist section in the curriculum that aims to make science more representative of our actual communities. By bringing science role models to students in the context of science learning, we get to address how our students view science and scientists, and who gets to do science and who gets to be the expert. And they have a much more accurate representation of how knowledge is being generated on this planet. Second, they have a spotlight the way science has been portrayed and how this might be biased and how it's misappropriated in its application to human populations. And there are many ways, finally, there are many ways of incorporating these decolonial concepts into the actual content of the curriculum instead of just slapping it as an add-on. Topics on genetics and human evolution are great ways in which to examine our misconception of race while teaching basic biology concepts. To give you a very specific example, the genetic support for the concept of race and ethnicity is really weak. If we sample a bunch of people from different populations and look at their DNA, over 80% of genetic variation arises from differences among individuals and can be explained by differences among individuals. Less than 10% is explained from difference in populations, and a really low amount, the rest of it, around 6%, are from differences among ethnicities or geographic regions. This means the vast majority of human genetic variation can be explained by differences among individuals, and the biological support for the concept of race is not a strong one. And you can examine these while teaching basic genetics concepts. Here are 2 example slides created by Natasha Young for this class. One is an example of Spotlight a Scientist. They looked at Hildreth Poindexter, who is the first African-American MD PhD, and talked about his work. And another slide is an example of Spotlight the way that science, non-objective science, behind BMI has been used to justify higher insurance premiums. So BMI, or body mass index, was developed based on a small sample of only Caucasian male participants, which again is not representative of the community that you're trying to represent. So this is a real world example of how science can be used to perpetuate inequities. A great resource for these topics is scientistspotlight.org, where you have to sign up to reach the content, but they have this fantastic selection of scientists to spotlight searchable by subtopics in the sciences. And I will put a link and suggested resources that I can send to Nicola, and you can email it out. But they have tips and tools for implementations, and you can peruse his website. It's great. So another avenue for decolonizing your curriculum is fairly obvious. Why not use history for a decolonial historical context? I'm going to give you 3 examples in 3 different fields and show you how to apply them to zoology. So let's consider first the history curriculum of Singapore, where I am from. So it's more of a personal experience. But Singapore, as we all know, was a British colony, and my father was actually born as a British subject. In his school days, as a little kid in Singapore, he was taught about the glory of the British Empire, justifications of colonialism, and this part is very interesting. Anti-French sentiments were passed on to him as a child, despite the fact that there was negligible French influence in Singapore. One generation later, when I was a kid, my curriculum focused more on Japanese occupation of Singapore and the cultural history of Southeast Asia. And curriculum in my universities then had a far more critical and nuanced view of colonialization, and a far more critical view, especially within the context of British colonization. So Singapore is not a great example, as we tend to celebrate our colonial history, but you'll see much better examples of decolonization across Commonwealth countries, like India and Malaysia, which have a much more critical view of colonialism than Singapore. And looking at what they have done with their history curriculum is really exciting. Exploring the ugly history of eugenics, which is the practice of advocacy of controlled selective breeding of human populations, is a great way to examine the history of genetics. And genetics underpins everything that we study in biology. Eugenics has been used to justify colonialism, slavery, genocide, and despite it being an objective science of its day. So many universities should and do confront their histories of teaching eugenics in attempts to decolonize their curriculum. My own department had a eugenics course 100 years ago. And much like zoology, geography is a field with deep roots in colonialism, and confronting its uncomfortable past is a way that National Geographic is dealing with decolonization. I highly recommend this article by the editor-in-chief, where Nat Geo does some soul searching and examines critically how their coverage over the years have promoted and upheld racist views and practices, and how to undo the harms of these practices. So looking back to look forward. So drawing from the previous examples in history, genetics, and geography, we can then apply the same concepts to the ology of your choosing. And what better way to examine the history of zoology than through a repository of historical collections in museums? With museum collections, you can start to ask yourself and ask your students, why are there so many tropical species named after non-tropical biologists? What is the history of the expeditions that led to these collections? Who benefited from these collections? Where in the world are these collections stored? And who has access to these collections? Whose science benefits from access to these collections? And all the while, there are some basic scientific concepts of speciation, nomenclature, species preservation, holotypes, animal anatomy, and so on and so forth that can be taught in the classroom while baking in this decolonial lens. So I'm finally going to move into an analogy that can help us when making mistakes, which we all do. These are sensitive and potentially volatile topics, and it's human nature to either avoid talking about it or to retreat and hide behind your scientific language, or crawl into a hole and expire when you make a mistake. Many people who grow up being part of the majority race or ethnicity in a location are unlikely to have race come up as a casual topic. So this discomfort can lead to some very uncomfortable situations. However, right now, I just want everyone, regardless of who you are and what your identity is, to accept the fact that you are going to mess up and it's not up for debate. And the real question is, what are you going to do about it when you do make a mistake? And this applies to everything in life, really, not even just decolonizing your curriculum. I love this boot analogy for how to handle mistakes, and you're going to find yourself in awkward situations talking about race or ethnicity or any other sort of minoritized or oppressed group, and you're going to make a faux pas. And imagine that your privilege is a heavy boot that keeps you from feeling when you're stepping on someone else's feet or they are stepping on yours, while oppressed people only have sandals. So people can trample on your boots and you wouldn't even notice it. If someone says to you, ouch, you're stepping on my toes, how should you react? Let's start with how not to react. So do not focus on yourself and say things like, I can't believe you think I'm a toe stepper. I am a good person. Don't deny that others' experiences are different from your own. We all have different worldviews. I don't mind when people step on my toes. Why do you care? Don't refuse to focus on the people that are impacted. All toes matter. Let's just treat all toes equally. Don't tone police. I'd move my foot if you asked me more nicely. And don't deny that the problem is fixable. Toes getting stepped on is a fact of life. You'd be better off when you just accept it. Don't victim blame, which is you shouldn't have been walking around people with boots to begin with. Or withdrawing. I thought you wanted my help. I guess not. I'll just go home. And don't get defensive. Let's not make this about our different footwear when it literally is about your different footwear. So things to do when you do make a mistake, focus on the impacted. Are you okay? Listen to their response and learn. Apologize for the impact even though you didn't intend it. I'm sorry. It's not novel. You step on someone's toes. Are you okay? I'm sorry. And you stop the instance and move the foot and stop the pattern, which is be careful where you step in the future. And this is where we can bring a decolonial lens into it and examine and deconstruct the pattern, where you can ask yourself, what about the history of footwear created a difference in footwear to begin with? How does this affect the way that different feet experience the world? And maybe we can just flog the dead horse of this analogy and go even one step further and say, why not burn all boots and sandals and give everyone Crocs? And on that note, as a herpetologist, I'm really happy that the final slide of my presentation is the word Crocs. And with that, I would love to take questions. Thank you so much for listening to my talk and taking time out of your busy day to come here. Please connect with me any way you can. I love talking about biology and everything else, really. Thank you to my contributors. And I would love to speak with people if they want to stay behind after this talk. Thank you very much.